Thank you. As many of us who've been in the military know, a challenge of leadership is to understand the people you lead. And I will tell you, as I entered into the military, I had men and women that I was responsible for from all different backgrounds and all different places in the country when I myself was quite young and hadn't experienced a lot of what happens throughout the country. And I think education and understanding on the very people that as military members we are often charged with leading is critically important and something that most of us strive for, to understand how we can best take care of the people under our command. And, you know, I'm glad that my colleague found the military to be a welcoming place. I did not always feel that. I was told by one of my flight instructors that it was going to be very uncomfortable for him to have a woman as a flight student, because in his belief system, you know, women should not be in flight school. That was not very welcoming. And unfortunately, I think we've found today that there are women still experiencing that in the United States Marine Corps, who until this committee, you know, stood up and asked about their situation, they were on the way to being processed out for filing complaints about sexual assault and harassment. The week after our committee brought it up, they were reinstated. It should not take a hearing from the House Armed Services Committee to do that. So I think we are seeing that there are problems with having a welcoming military to people from different backgrounds and some things that are poorly understood in our military. And I think it is incumbent upon us to ensure that people in leadership in the United States military understand how best to lead people from diverse backgrounds, who are looking to be part of the fighting force and are looking to volunteer to defend our country. With that, I'll yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I look at this amendment, and very much like my colleague Pat Fallon from Texas, I think to myself, what is it exactly that we're asking for here? A report. A report to actually understand what has DEI actually done for our armed forces. And when I look at this, I identify a couple of things, having served in the military for a long time, but also serving in government as a whole, to where I spent 7 years of my life in Iraq, 3 years of my life in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia, was blown up twice in '06. I can tell you that not a single person that I served with, whether it was Michael Johnson, who is from Bushwick and who is a black male, or whether it was our friend, you know, Alfredo Perez from Puerto Rico, or whether it was others who was from Cambodia who lived out in San Francisco, or otherwise, did we care what we looked like? Nor did our enemies. Those bullets, those bombs, none of them cared what color you were, what race you identify with, and that's the difference here. It's a big difference when we talk about inclusion versus division, equity versus equality, identity as opposed to meritocracy. We are about strengthening our forces. And if you walk out to Arlington Cemetery right now, where I have people that I served with buried, and you don't know the person who's actually in that grave, and all you see is a name, you couldn't tell me the color of skin of that individual who has served our armed forces and died for our armed forces. As far as I'm concerned, I look at the numbers. I look at our recruitment, and very much what General Bergman has said through his 40-plus years, it is about recruitment, retention, and readiness. We don't need to focus on diversity, equity, inclusion. It needs to be increased lethality, readiness, and being properly prepared. Because our adversaries are spending 0 hours when it comes to China and Russia thinking about these things. And all we're asking for is a report to understand how this has helped. Because I can tell you that if you look at some of the DEI resources, here's one of the websites that includes reading that says, when white bodies say, tell me what to do, it states, if you have a white body and you've just begun to recognize how white body supremacy affects the world and harms you, here are some ways to sink your toes into somatic abolitionism. Does that sow inclusion or division? And I think that when we look at our numbers at 25,000 in deficit and 8,600 if you add into those who were purged out of the COVID, you're talking about 3 Army divisions that we're short in our recruitment efforts. That tells me that DEI is not only not working, but it's actually impacting and negatively to our recruitment and retention capabilities. So I think a report to understand this should be welcomed, as well as for how money is being spent, which is our job as stewards of taxpayers' funding. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair, and I recognize Ms. Takuda for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, I plan on voting no on this amendment. I had not planned on speaking until I heard that racism is diminishing in America. If we ever needed a reason, an example as to why we need to teach critical race theory and diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's statements like this. If we fail to learn from the mistakes of our past, and this country has made mistakes, whether it was strategic, military, human rights, civil rights, then we are doomed to repeat it. And I'm speaking as the representative of constituents whose families suffered at the hands of the Chinese Exclusion Act, as the great-granddaughter of someone who was interned in the Japanese internment camps while his son, my grandfather, fought for a country that thought his family was aliens, essentially, fought in the military intelligence service all the while to prove his loyalty to this country. We have definitely made mistakes as a country. And as I listen to the kinds of rhetoric I hear here and the amendments that I see today that we will be voting on, I am terrified for my children, and more so, I am saddened for our country, that it looks very clearly we have not made any progress in learning from the mistakes of our past. In fact, we are doomed to repeat it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.